Okay, welcome back, everybody. And this is the panel and the conversation that continues on the Eastern Mediterranean. And I'm the director of Southeast European Studies at Oxford. And we are starting a program on the Eastern Mediterranean. And we are also working with some of the people here at this embassy as well. It's actually very good for us because tomorrow we are holding a workshop there on the region. But for those who missed this morning, there was another panel with the Greek and the Greek Cypriot ambassadors who kind of presented the positions of the Republic of Cyprus and Greece on the issue of the East Med, and there was more talk about the Cyprus problem. As was mentioned. And now we are kind of widening the discussion in terms of looking at the region where Cyprus is in the middle. We would like to discuss a little bit what are the themes, what is the region, how do we understand the region. And for this, we've got three great panelists. We will start with Ambassador Tom Miller, who knows the region inside out. Manal Shehabi, who is our Oxford colleague, among other things, and she also knows the region inside out from a political economy and energy perspective, but she's also the region herself because she comes from various countries in the region, and then George, who you met this morning. So let's start with Ambassador, with Tom, and then we'll proceed with Manal and then with George.
Thank you, Othon. So I just want to lay out the parameters. The Eastern Med, I'll tell you a little story. As you might have seen from my bio, I spent almost 3 decades in the U.S. State Department, and I spent a considerable amount of that time doing Greece and Cyprus. I never got to Turkey, but I spent a lot of time in Turkey as a negotiator. And in the State Department, which is a pretty traditional, staid, old school type of organization. I can say all these things now because I'm no longer there. They always kind of put Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus off to the side. And in the European Bureau. And that was kind of an indicator, well, you know, it's relatively not as important as the rest of the countries in Europe. And I would make a point, and I never quarreled with that because I never got orders from the State Department when I was ambassador in Greece. I just kind of did my own thing. So that's good. You know, that's what you want as an ambassador. But if today I would quarrel with that distinction, and I think people in the U.S. government do understand how much more important Greece, Turkey, really the Eastern Med is, and I'm going to make an argument that the Eastern Med goes well beyond Greece, Turkey, Cyprus. Definitely the centrality of those 3 countries. Usually when we define an area, we talk about geography. You know, the Middle East, which has got all kinds of really strange connotations. Middle to what? You know, the Far East or East Asia. And so it's geographically contiguous countries. I would argue that when you're talking about the Eastern Med today, obviously you take energy into account. That's a big, big deal, and that's something that's very important. You also should take security into account. So it's not just geography. And so what we end up doing is carving off at least 3 more countries, Lebanon, Israel, Egypt. And you can make an argument one way or another about Libya, and that's kind of that's a discussion in and of itself, because Libya does play on the energy side most definitely in this dynamic. There are some other dimensions as well to the Eastern Med. And in the last 10 years, one of the dimensions we've seen is refugees, migrants coming across. You know, their point of entry coming either from Africa or from, as far as Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, what have you, is either Greece or Italy. And I'm not making the argument that we should kind of make the Eastern Med include Italy, even though I think, one could. So refugee flows and refugee/migrant flows, I think, is a very important dimension that people kind of sometimes miss. And it's going to continue. I was, until recently, chair of an organization called the International Commission on Missing Persons that was charged by the EU to try to identify the dead people that they've recovered from these missing. That's a phenomenon that's going to continue, and it's going to continue big time in the Eastern Med. So I think you got to put that one in that basket as well. So that's kind of the dimensions that I see, and my colleagues will talk a little bit more, particularly about energy, which is a big, big deal. And it's a big deal for the United States because it's no longer little Noble oil or Noble Energy. It was bought by Chevron. And so, that's one that the U.S. is very concerned about. The outside players, and there are some very important outside players, are obviously the EU, and there's many dimensions to this. I don't think on the Greek-Turkish stuff, which also impinges on energy, Greek-Turkish Cyprus, really Cypriot Turkish, I don't see the EU as a mediator. It's just not going to happen. U.S. has a big interest, and it's woken up, and it knows that this is an important area for us to focus on, in large part because of energy. I can't really conceptualize of what the Russian interest would be other than causing trouble, and don't discount that. I know a lot of oligarchs park their money in Cyprus. Cyprus has tightened up on things, so they're going to other places now. And then China. Don't ever discount China. And China is a big player as well. And one of its principal objectives is to try to split the EU and the US. They do not like us cooperating because they see this as somewhat of a zero-sum game. So the issues I've talked about before, security, and there are multiple issues on the security front. And I'm not going to even get into the Middle East, Gaza, stuff like that, because if you do, you're really opening up a can of worms that you're just not going to be able to put back, or I should say squeezing out the toothpaste, you're not going to be able to put back in the tube. Some people would say this is an area that's ripe for a big deal. And diplomats love big deals. I mean, like, take every problem, throw it in the hopper, and try to come up with something. And part of any big deal would, of course, be settling Cyprus. I personally don't think that's a good idea. I think that dealing with Cyprus should be in and of itself. I don't think it should be, but I might, others are entitled to their own opinions. And I really, I was the negotiator for the U.S., 25 years ago. So I'm really dated. I've tried to stay up on things. There's a Canadian guy who was a peacekeeper in the 80s, and he got his PhD on Cyprus and blah, blah, blah. And I heard him once, at a presentation. And he does a lot of polling in Cyprus, and he says the older people want a settlement. The young people don't. They never grew up with any memories of United Cyprus. And so that's a separate discussion out there, but my own opinion is be wary of the grand deal. I do think there are opportunities to settle the Greek-Turkish tensions, conflicts in the Aegean continental shelf, territorial waters, the whole gamut. And Erdogan and Mitsotakis seem to be talking. This is hard. This is really hard because they are so far apart on their concepts of what a settlement would look like. But there could be some possible work on that. What I would do and we're going to have this conference at Oxford for the next couple of days, and try to define the parameters, define the area, define the problem, define the issues. I hope that's what we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Assuming that we can make some progress on that, and it's great when you're track 2 people, you can do anything you want because you got no responsibility, and we're all track 2 people now, right? One of the things I would suggest is if there can be some definitions, some agreement on commonalities, et cetera, I would use the Madrid peace process as a model. And I'm going to conclude right now. Ultimately it didn't work. Well, it got the PLO to recognize Israel, the state of Israel, and that was a big deal. It got them together. It got them in negotiations. They got close a couple times. And I'm not saying that the Eastern Med should do the Israel-Palestinian stuff. That is separate. Don't touch it, in our forum. But I think the format that we did would be useful. One of the things that spun out of the Madrid peace process is that there were 5 multilateral working groups, and I headed one of the 5. I headed one on the environment. There was one on refugees, environment, business development, water. I forget the 5th. And I think if we make some progress, you could go to track 1.5 relatively easily by coming up with working groups to kind of really chew over some of these issues. So let me stop there, and again, thank you for the kind invitation to join you today.
Thank you very much, Tom. Indeed, it's great that you started with the conceptualization of this region. It's very difficult to define. It's not like other more conventional regions with borders and states, but it's more of a maritime. And then you start thinking, is Libya part of it? Is it not? Is Italy? Is it not? But it's very much also a region of corridors, be that energy, migration, culture, it's that kind of connectivity. And discord. Apart from the Western perspective, there is also the Middle Eastern and the North African perspective as well, to which I hope that you could also respond a little bit to that as well, how this is defined, along with the other things that you would like to say, Manal.
Sure, thank you very much. Indeed, I wanted to respond actually, because I think if we look more beyond geography and also culture and cuisine and all the historic things that really kind of connect the region, I think the region we will see that easily it's not just it's beyond really Turkey, Greece, Cyprus, and if we look at the geography, where is actually the Mediterranean on the eastern side? And then that would include, of course, Lebanon, it would include Israel and the Palestinian territories, it would extend to Jordan, which has been historically pre-Sykes-Picot part of the region anyway, and then it would also include Syria, which for obvious reasons politically are not included. So I think when we talk about what is Eastern Med as a region, there is the political word that we use versus what it could actually mean as a potential, as well as what in terms of the opportunities that exist and what really binds a region we can have. And I think that is also something to really consider quite in the configuration of what are the opportunities there. And I don't say this only as someone from the region, but also as someone when you just kind of look at the history, but also the future. There's a lot of interconnectivity there. As a child swimming in the sea from Lebanon, the joke was if we swam a little bit too far, they would say, where are you going, to Cyprus? Because that was how close it was, but also culturally. And I think all of these things, we often forget how important these things are in connecting us today. but these are really integral to, I think, also when we find a peaceful, hopefully prosperous region and what that really entails for the different parts of the region. And maybe here I can kind of move on to some of the elements that I think would be important for the prosperity of the region. I think despite its small size and maybe considered from a Western US perspective as maybe not that important, at least historically, I say this definitely as a person from the region. We cannot underestimate the current importance of it. And I think going in the future, the region is just going to have an increasing role, and we kind of start seeing already some aspects of that currently. And if we look at history, I mean, as you said, this corridor, Othon, that corridors historically is really kind of where I think we're going to have, again, corridors in the future. I might want to just say three main points to kind of highlight this. The first is, where is, and I think you touched upon it in terms of, Tom, in terms of the energy part. So where is, when we think of Eastern Med today, we often think of the Eastern Med Gas Forum, and we often think of gas. And of course, gas has been probably the first thing that in the last few years had really kind of brought the Eastern Med to the map of everybody. And the question is it ever going to happen? Is the gas forum really going to be something that will offer Europe, particularly sources and energy security, especially after the war in Ukraine and less reliance on the Russian exports? So that's always going to be an issue. But also to what extent is this really, I think, a source of generating also more revenue and cooperation and collaboration among the different countries? And of course, in the region, we have two countries, that Israel and Turkey, who have not signed the UNCLOS, the UN Treaty on the Law of the Seas. So that also brings conflict of where we draw the different zones, the economic zones that are dedicated for each party. But that is indeed an opportunity, I think, that will, even going forward, will be important to consider. And also, even with the move away from gas and fossil fuels into energy and clean energy sources, I think the gas forum, even though at the moment we really have some potential and some starts, but we also know that there's a lot of operations that have halted. But I think it's not just going to be important for gas, but also for other forms of energy. And in the light, I don't want to talk much unless anyone has questions on the Gaza situation and the war in Gaza, but even some of the projects also came to a stop, particularly because of the war. So we can see that there are implications that might delay that, but I do think that we cannot think of really achieve, whether it's from the European perspective or the other regions' perspective, the goals that we have for energy if we don't consider the Eastern Med and the opportunities that it offers. So that going forward is not only going to be for gas, but when we consider things like hydrogen and clean hydrogen that Europe wants, that has to go through the Eastern Med, and there's a huge opportunity here to consider the region in the larger frame. So that's the first point, I think, on energy. And of course, that offers significant opportunities, including for Cyprus, for development of energy sources, for economic revenue, and what that means for jobs, etc. The second point I'd like to highlight is, which is kind of related to energy, but also separate, is I think the emergence of the Eastern Med as also more of an economic power again. And I think we see that very, very clearly, not so much in and of itself, but more as really a connector, again, as a corridor. And we see this very clearly with the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. So extending from, it's 4,800 kilometers, I believe, from India all the way to Europe. And obviously going through the Gulf, so it goes through UAE and Saudi Arabia, and then Greece, and then all the way up to Europe. You cannot connect these two parts, the Gulf and India, of course, to Europe without going through the Eastern Med. And that is massive economic opportunity. That will, first, the 8 countries that have signed this represent about 40% of the world's population, close to 50% of the world economy, significant portions of the energy sources that are also exported. And then this is going to cut costs of trade by 40 to 50%. It's going to make trade significantly faster. This also will bring a lot of opportunities to the region. And indeed for Cyprus, that I hope Cyprus will also be able to take advantage of those and really bring that to benefit for Cypriots. But that again highlights how important the region is really becoming here from an economic perspective. And in here lies, I think, my third point on how this really works from a geopolitical perspective. Because we, and you highlighted in the earlier very beautifully really the major powers that are interested in the region. I think we also see now India, obviously starting with the India Middle East European Economic Corridor, being more interested in, part for its own, of course, emerging kind of as in kind of opposing China, but also becoming more interested, therefore, in the region. And there's a lot of, and that not only in trade of goods and trade of technology, and of course, trade of energy sources, definitely green hydrogen that will also be going through pipes and also through the Eastern Med. So that is quite important. And then we also see the Gulf countries that are not a major power, but also really want to become even more powerful from a geopolitical perspective and economic perspective in the region. And they also have had their own line, not necessarily following the European and the American lines of, no China, for example, or no interactions with Russia. They've really followed their own pragmatic line while also maintaining, and I think increasingly having the links with the Eastern Med. So if we look at these three kind of factors together, I think we really see where the opportunities lie for the Eastern Med. We also see that the Eastern Med is kind of like, small, but maybe have like, we were talking earlier, you mentioned the word tentacles, lots of tentacles that are extending beyond the region. And I think you can see the dimensions that the region has and why powers outside the region are interested in the region from the geopolitical, economic, energy perspective as well. And that obviously provides a lot of opportunities for collaboration.
Thank you very much, Manal. Indeed, you kind of broaden the geography of the space in order to show the particularly significant as a kind of a corridor between East-West, but also more broadly. And I cannot restrain myself from kind of taking opportunity from what you said, because I come from Crete. When I was swimming into the south of Crete, they would tell me, don't go too far because you're going to reach Libya. And George, now to you to comment and possibly also put a little bit of Cyprus into the picture, given that we are all seeing now how Cyprus is kind of diversifying its foreign policy in terms of humanitarian assistance, in terms of energy, migration, and it's not just about the Cyprus problem.
Totally. Thank you. I mean, it's really difficult to be speaking such a panel. There's so much wisdom. You feel a bit of like an imposter. But what I'll try to do is I'll try to give kind of a dynamic interpretation, chronological interpretation of developments in the region, and then kind of conclude by arguing where Cyprus and the UK are currently, in which position they're placed in, but also which position they should be placed in. The first thing I'd like to argue is that the region is critical for Euro-Atlantic security. The two ambassadors, I think, did a really good job highlighting this in the panel this morning. But let me start by kind of, and Tom is here to correct me, of course, if I say something wrong, but let me start by kind of offering a narrative of how I view the region to have started, because when we talk about the East Med, we think of it as if it was always there, and, the geographic landmarks and countries and mountains and rivers and seas were always there. But we weren't really using the term East Mediterranean, were we? So there's something to the term itself that signifies something. So the first thing to say perhaps is, around the beginning of the 2010, around that time, I remember when we discovered the oil and gas in Cyprus, which followed the two oil and gas fields in Israel, the discoveries, right? And everybody in Cyprus thought they were going to be a sheikh. We thought of joining the United Arab Emirates because that's how wealthy we would be because of the gas that we found. And then at some point realized that's not really happening, right? But what happened in the meantime? There's a very nice speech, I think it took place on the 22nd of November 2014 in Turkey, by who was then the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden. And Joe Biden said, it's imperative that we find a way to develop East Mediterranean energy and fit it into Europe, right? And it was very interesting to hear from Tom that the East Med was kind of, or Greece, Cyprus, Turkey was kind of on the side of the Europe Department, because it shows how much thinking depth relative to us, how much more that thinking depth exists in the State Department, contrary to perhaps the European Union that didn't see this coming, right? So the Americans saw this energy crisis coming. They said Russia is going to weaponize energy, Russia has this tendency, and we need to find alternative solutions, energy solutions, to be able to maintain European energy security. Those were the precise words, I'm paraphrasing a bit, but those were the words of Joe Biden at the time. Now, fast forward to 2022, what was the first thing that the EU did? They tried to sign an agreement with Israel and Egypt. They did, right? The memorandum. Why? Because they realized that we've run out of gas. We haven't got Russia anymore. We've run out of gas. And I'm not trying to argue that East Med gas is of equal volume or it can replace Russian gas. But if we want to talk about numbers, the inflation in this country in October 2022 was 14%. If we had an alternative, it could have been 10%, it could have been 9%, right? So this shows what I would like to call a lack of strategic depth, which I think is now being rectified. I think kind of stakeholders in the region are now understanding the importance of talking about the East Med, of having the East Med on board, right? So the first number one is energy. Of course, the East Med is not just about energy, as the other speakers have said. Another critical kind of angle is stability, right? Let's consider how much the UK has spent reacting to the events in Israel, Gaza, sending warships, kind of sending planes to bomb the Houthis and shoot down Iranian rockets, right? And drones. And it's not just the pure cost of, the fuels of the vessels, the fuel of the planes, the cost of the bombs themselves. It's also the fact that we really came close to spillover that would have endangered not just the region, but also Euro-Atlantic security, right? So we have these two important dimensions that I really want to flag. And I think that's what's playing a critical role in how the UK and Cyprus understandings are also shaping, but also how they're coming together. In recent times, people in this room know that British relations to Cyprus pass through the British bases and also through Turkey. But I think that now the Foreign Office and the British government, and I think this is going to be shared by the next government, they're seeing Cyprus as part of the East Med, part of this regional dimension, right? And this regional dimension that is imperative, not just to Cypriot or British security, but also Euro-Atlantic security. Because without energy and without stability, that is detrimental to Euro-Atlantic security. We don't have too much time, so I don't want to say much more, but I just wanted to offer those remarks.
Thank you, George, and that was already a lot of ideas for a further discussion. I would like to invite you to, if you had any questions or quick comments to make on what you heard. There have been a number of issues that have been there on the table for you. Sorry?
We only have 5 minutes.
Okay, we've got 5 minutes, so you need to think fast. Yes.
Just a quick question to
I'm going to take more questions, and go on.
The shifting of Turkey to autocracy and the relations that we develop with Russia, let's say not enforcing the sanctions or trade relations, all this stuff. Is it something that the United States have to worry about? And if we put the game that the relations with Israel is also working with Hamas support from Turkey.
Thank you. Can we take another one? You keep that for Ahmed, I think you threw your hand. Yeah.
The question is, how long do you think we will become independent with our own gas reserves?
Yes, let's get a third one, and then we'll go to the second round.
Othon, don't do
Okay,
three
I'm not
questions.
going to do this.
I just got off a plane. I can
All
barely
right.
remember two.
No worries.
Okay, let me just answer the first, and then you go for the second. Your question kind of got me thinking, one of the key dimensions that we didn't mention is leadership. And leadership is really, really important. And right now, in my life, I think you have the worst constellation of leadership in the world that I've ever seen. And so my comment to you is the value of the kind of stuff that we're thinking of doing isn't necessarily to do it today, because you have a real difficult time with Erdogan. He's very unpredictable. That's a conversation in itself. You have an extremely difficult time with Netanyahu, who is totally focused on his own existence, and that's a conversation in itself. You have an extremely, extremely difficult time with Putin because of his focus, and that's another conversation. So what I'm saying is, this is a terrible time for deals, but it doesn't mean that you don't set it up and be ready to go when there's a better time. I remember when I was doing the Cyprus negotiations, the stumbling block was Denktash. Just couldn't get past him. But then Denktash died, and you had Akinci. And Akinci, we actually got a deal with him, but then the stumbling block became Papadopoulos. And that's another conversation, with the referendum in 2004. And so what I'm saying is, you raised Erdogan, and I'm saying, hey, you raised a much bigger set of issues. You can have a great plan and the wrong time, and it's not going to work. And the wrong time is when you have leaders who are focused on other things, usually their own survival.
Thank you. And you haven't even mentioned the possibility of Trump becoming a president. That's even more scary.
We don't have enough time for that.
Yeah. Manal.
Can I clarify your question? Who's we, when you said we will?
Sorry, Republic of Cyprus.
Oh, Cyprus. Sorry, for a moment I thought you were talking about the UK and I got confused. So the question is, how long would it take for Cyprus to be gas dependent or energy dependent? Independent. So I think it depends. Obviously, independence is how do you define independence, of course, right? So I think there is a lot of potential renewable energy power that I think not deployed enough in Cyprus that really has a lot of potential for that to really be used. And then you can also look at how much, it should not only be gas dependent in terms of how long we're going to be, because the more renewables also you have, then obviously you're extending the life of the gas. And I think based on those and how much you're able to get out of the ground as well. So I'm not going to give you a year. I think often people ask me for things, even when I do economic modeling, wanting an exact year, and my answer to that is I'm not going to play God usually, but I think it is not impossible for Cyprus to become energy independent. That's what I'm going to say. But I think there's still infrastructure and investments that need to be done, I think, both on the gas front and definitely on the renewables front, that both have to be optimized for independence to happen. And then you could also have some for exports as well. Those are really, I think, the opportunity there, but you need the infrastructure, the investments, etc. And obviously access to gas fields as well.
So, George, shall we give the opportunity to another two questions, and then we'll. So,
can I just say one more thing about your question? I did a lot of work on Israel and the Palestinian thing in the 80s and 90s. And Israel, people forget this. Israel was totally dependent on outside sources for energy. It's now totally self-sufficient with the gas that it's got. That really changed the dynamic in Israel in a very, very fundamental way. And I think when that happens in Cyprus, and it will happen, it will really, really change the way you interact with the rest of the world, the whole dynamic.
Okay, Two more.
Okay, more than a question, I start with the remarks of Ambassador Miller, and that this is not the right time of making deals due to the alignment of leadership. I agree, but I also think that track 2 diplomacy is the way out right now in order to prepare for the day when we have those leaders with the political will to actually not start from scratch, but to find those blueprints that track 2 produce. In that manner, the EMGF, I think, was a good start, but it's not totally inclusive. So we have to find some ways, I think, to also include the elephant in the room, which is Turkey, and also broaden this, not just the gas itself, but taking energy in a much broader sense.
Okay.
And the inclusivity it is the creativity of diplomacy that it should include all the stakeholders. I'm not saying states, by the way, saying stakeholders, and that we can actually learn from some of the at least good things in the region, which was this Lebanese-Israeli deal in the maritime delimitation, that it can inspire us to solve some of the other problems.
Thank you. And one more. Thank you, please.
Just highlighting the
Yeah.
Lebanese, no one even said anything about it. I'm glad you did, because that was a major deal, considering that Lebanon and Israel don't even have relations.
Yeah.
But,
Enemies.
you know, that was a big deal. And so if that can happen, other stuff that's considered a very heavy lift can happen as well.
That's right.
Thank you. I wanted to ask if energy cooperation, all of the panel referred to the importance of energy. Can energy bring peace in the region of Eastern Mediterranean? We're talking about two frozen, not very frozen actually at the moment, Palestine and Cyprus issues. Can the energy cooperation bring sort of peace in the region? Thank you.
Thank you. The perennial old question. So very briefly, each one of you.
Shall I give it a go?
Yes, go.
On energy and peace, you know, there was for a long time there was this idea of the peace pipeline, right, which has been widely discredited. But energy, you know, why is energy important? It's not just obviously Euro-Atlantic stuff; it's very, very important. But you know, something that the Americans did in their wisdom is to try and force agreements between Israel and Jordan, but not only. And that, you see, has kind of played its part in ensuring that there's positive codependencies and there's less of a desire to incur the cost out of you know, attacking each other, because there's things there that will be damaged, right? So, but the question is, how do you do it? How do you approach this energy thing? Obviously, my opinion, as I said, is that if you induce this energy codependence on a regional level, then that you have the best chance of stabilizing a very problematic region, right? But then, as you know, as it was said about the elephant in the room, how do you bring Turkey on the table, right? Turkey is right now has a revisionist neo-Ottoman foreign policy. It's occupying Cyprus, it's occupying Iraq, it's occupying Syria, right? It doesn't show a desire to even come to the table with its Euro-Atlantic partners. There was a big publication in the Politico yesterday about how Turkey is enabling Russia to bypass all the Western sanctions. Turkey showed no appetite to change that, despite being punished by the Americans, not getting the F-35s, which went to Greece, and getting instead the lesser, not even fourth generations F-16s, right? So how do you, of course, you know, I mean, if there was a magic wand to bring Turkey to the table, that's the ideal scenario, right? That's how you resolve everything. You create a pipeline, you create whatever you want at the time, and you induce positive dependencies out of the custodianship of the United States, but how do you make that happen? And this is, if you find the answer to that solution, then you've resolved the whole ISMET issue. And we don't have to be on this panel as well. We can go home and have a drink.
Manal, on the inclusivity and on the potential of energy, whatever you want.
On the inclusivity, I think it's a two-way street. I think, yes, Turkey has to want to come to the table, but I think also the other part has to also open and be inclusive and say, this is what we're also offering at the same time, right? So I think if at one, inclusivity is going to be extremely important, I think. But getting there is, I think, the challenge. It's not the concept, it's how you get there. And I think we still, there is a zero-sum game often in the politics and the geopolitics of the region. And for us to get into an inclusivity situation, it has to be not a zero-sum game. We're all benefiting from this. And it also has to basically come with willingness from different parties and, dare I say, acceptance. And this is probably the biggest part to kind of also accept. And then, and I think ultimately what's interesting about trade, and including in energy, is that yes, indeed, it does trump a lot of the politics. And the Lebanon-Israel was a great example, but also you see other examples, even within, even when gas was still flowing despite war. I mean, those examples still exist. So I think inclusivity, yes, will be important. And maybe I will link that to also, how do we include also the countries that are also at war, and how energy can then be an enabler for peace. I think we're looking at two different things. I agree with George that in the example of Jordan and Israel, which was facilitated by the US, it brought peace. But the countries were formally enemies, but there was no war between them, right? I think this is very, very different. And Jordan needed a lot of, had an incentive really to get into signing that agreement. I think energy cooperation will lead to a lot of stability, but on the Palestine story in particular, it will not necessarily in itself lead to peace. That is a massively separate situation that involves or requires a lot more work than energy, because there's occupation. And I think that the answer here is obviously clear on that.
Thank you. Can I ask for a very quick point, because they want to continue the next.
My answer to your question would be no and maybe. No on the Palestinian, I agree. You know, the issues on the Palestinian-Israeli front are so complicated. And frankly, you know, I would say if you could get a change in leadership on both sides, you could have a deal. But that's not going to happen in the near future, and energy is not going to be an enabler of it. Maybe on Cyprus. You know, I mean, I said earlier, I don't see a grand deal. But there's a lot of win-win that comes out of energy for everyone. And as long as the energy stays in the ground, no one wins. So maybe there might be something, because on a deal with Cyprus, there's a couple of big pay-fors. You got to come up with compensation. And when I was doing the negotiations, it was estimated $10 billion. And now it's much more than that. And number two, you got to come up, you know, this is kind of like a West Germany, East Germany kind of thing. If you're going to really integrate the island into one country, the North is a lot poorer than the South. And you're going to have funds in some way, shape, or form to redress that balance. So I say maybe.
Thank you. So join me in thanking this excellent panel. I also want to thank Cyprus Forum and for this partnership. That's been great. I hope we continue to do more. And Cyprus High Commission for the hospitality. Thank you.
Thank you.